Let's dive into the development of developmental science itself, in a budding critique of developmental theory. As all of you know, I'm a grad student exploring these concepts in the context of my own situational experience, but also in the emergent theoretical orientation, which I would consider to be integrated from existential transpersonal, feminist, and postmodern theories. I am a mother. I'm 50 years old, white. I grew up in extreme poverty. My father was very sick with alcoholism. My mother also struggled with substance abuse. I am an only child. I endured what prevailing wisdom would consider emotional neglect. There was emotional violence in my household. My parents divorced when I was 9 years old, and my ACE score is about a 5. According to prevailing developmental theory, I didn't successfully complete any stages. I am clinically poorly attached. I was locked outside of the critical and sensitive windows due to my unfortunate circumstances. From a deterministic perspective, those are losses never to be recovered. In direct contrast, I do not consider my upbringing to be anything other than that. My upbringing, it was rich with unique challenges and all of the ingredients which have led to my particular constellation and to me, the me that I have grown to love. I do not feel that I missed out on things or that things should have been different, although it has been a journey to get here. Here's my opinion. The Western model of psychology presupposes that humans are fundamentally psychologically healthy. Lamar et al., 2014. Psychological health is then overlaid on all of us as the norm, to which we are then ruthlessly measured and compared. Deviations from the construct are considered pathological, the roots of that pathology presumably taking hold deep in the psyche and growing out of missing and suboptimal childhood experiences. Fault lands like a ton of bricks on the too distant, too hovering, under or overly emotional primary caregiver, a role to which the mother is biologically wired, culturally burdened, while simultaneously having been stripped of all value. The developmental theories of which we speak have been informed by observing extreme situations and creating inhumane laboratory systems of deprivation designed to disrupt the mother-infant bond, and I wonder how much disruption, disease, and dysregulation arise from the success of this very system. What did the mother endure, and the mother's mother? Here are my assumptions moving forward. They arise from a feminist, postmodern persuasion, and they inform this discussion that I'm leading. Much of developmental theory has established a framework for normal development. The frameworks and the confines of normal have traditionally been defined by Western elite white adult men who were educated in a system governed and created by those in their likeness. These individuals were not in the habit of situating their theories and claiming their biases, and therefore created constructs of normal that were limited in scope yet applied equally to everyone. With possibly the exception of Piaget, who was 11 when he wrote his first scientific paper, Cherry 2019, these developmental frameworks are being built with hindsight. With grandeur, hindsight has a way of imposing possibility where none actually existed in the moment. For example, if the mother had performed within the construct we have created using hindsight, language, and intellect, a perfect, normal, healthy child would have emerged. If he or she had acted just right to meet the perceived needs of the homogenized child, then the conditions would have been just right to create the perfect or normal as it has been defined, which would result then, of course, in a perfectly adjusted and well-adapted normal adult. Normal is a form of violence. Normal demands conformity to a constructed standard and pathologizes or others everything outside of the parameters of normal. Othering and pathologizing create the very conditions that psychology seeks to ameliorate. There are essentially 4 primary questions or themes around which developmental psychology is formed. Nature versus nurture, whether development proceeds through determined, predetermined, or hardwired stages, whether there are critical or sensitive periods for development, and 4, the importance of early experience in shaping later growth and development. Let's move on to the dominant view. Allen states that traditionally, development is seen as having the shape of continued growth. It is cumulative and sequential in nature. Stages, whether loosely or tightly defined, string together a set of tasks that are increasingly complex. Regression to a previous stage is not usually considered. Where did we get these theories? Let's take a look at the forefathers of developmental psychology. Piaget kicked off the modern developmental model with his 4 cognitive stages. Freud was soon after on the scene in the 20th century with a very controversial 5 psychosexual stages, believing that development was fueled by sexual urges and essentially stopped after puberty. Influenced by Freud, Erikson picked up the torch, refining and reorganized the sexual stages around social development, offering us one of the most influential, comprehensive, and trusted models of development today, with 8 psychosocial stages spanning the entire life. It's worth noting here that Erikson was unique in presenting a lifespan model of development, and he loosened the rigidity around the specific stages, referring to them instead as phases that could be returned to throughout life, but emphasizing that each age range or stage was associated with specific tasks. Next up, and arising from the transpersonal school of psychology, Ken Wilber made significant advances to developmental theory by including spiritual growth in the spectrum model of development. Now, what all of these models have in common, however, is a procession through specific universal stages of growth. The models are hierarchical, they assume a single pathway, they are orderly, cumulative, and sequential, and depend on the successful completion of the preceding stage. Wilber and others have met with criticism for the rigid, linear, hierarchical, and sequential nature of their stages, but Wilber in particular for the hierarchical and sequential nature of his spiritual stages, among other things. However, Wilber made a rather enduring contribution to the field of psychology with the conception of the pre-trans fallacy. To understand the pre-trans fallacy, we need a crash course in Wilber's integral theory. In this model, all psychologies and all spiritual traditions are seen as right and containing partial truths about human consciousness. All of the partial truths are combined into a spectrum model of consciousness that can be compared to a spectrum of light, where only portions of the spectrum are visible. The Western models of psychology deal with the lower and middle portions of the spectrum, where psychosis is situated at the very bottom and is the most fragmented. Moving up the spectrum through neurosis and existential concerns, the middle portion of the spectrum still captures the attention of psychologists on up into the spiritual systems which occupy the upper regions, ending in enlightenment, which is the most unified consciousness possible, from Courtwright. The spectrum is broken into 3 basic levels: pre-personal, personal, and transpersonal. The pre-trans fallacy can be best understood as described directly by Courtwright. Wilber noted a major deficiency in conventional psychology, which has been to equate transpersonal states with pre-personal states. Because there are superficial similarities between ego loss that occurs in schizophrenia or other psychotic states, and the ego loss that can occur at the highest mystical experiences of enlightenment. Psychology, beginning with Freud, has assumed that they are one and the same. Even some early transpersonal psychologists have made this error by romanticizing childhood and likening the consciousness of an infant to that of a mystic. Wilber has made a very valuable distinction between prepersonal and transpersonal states. A state such as infancy does not have self-consciousness, but this prepersonal state, he asserts, is very different from a more developed transpersonal state in which self-consciousness has been gone through and transcended, leaving the person still self-reflexive but not ego-bound. Now, moving on to the emergent view. New research in adult development suggests that it is more fluid and individualistic in nature. People do not grow along a preconceived path, but develop their own path, which is affected by their cultural context, experiences, and motivations. In addition, the paths may look like a series of circles rather than a straight line on a graph. People may go backwards, forwards, up, down, and around. Whatever path they take, it will depend on the individual. Allen states that human development is a dynamic, nonlinear system, and that we need to borrow concepts from science of chaos in order to truly understand it. Like, in Chaos, Making a New Science has a word for this. He states that in a turbulent system, there are underlying patterns of order. However, this underlying order can only be seen in themes and patterns, not in specifically predictable ways. The pattern of order underlying the chaos has a sensitive dependence on initial conditions, which is his way of saying that whenever you change the initial conditions of a dynamic system, the underlying pattern changes. The takeaway. The stage-specific models, or dominant view, served several important functions in the evolution of developmental science. Most importantly, it sounded the alarm bells about the effects of trauma, neglect, and maltreatment of children. From the dominant view, we learned that abuse has the potential to imprison people in a life of suffering. The dominant view also demonstrates that traumatic, formative experiences can be linked to certain behaviors and beliefs in adulthood. The models demonstrate that developmental tasks are linked with specific characteristics and traits. The different models emerging from the stage-specific or dominant framework highlight important parts or fragments of the developmental process, such as needs for safety, autonomy, contribution, etc., and the resulting traits like trust, independence, and integrity. In summary, the dominant view highlighted dangers and possible impacts of encountering those dangers, but is woefully inadequate in other important ways. Arising from a mechanistic Newtonian point of view, the dominant model suggests that if all the parts are in working order, development would follow along a predetermined and predictable way, the end result being a normal and well-adjusted adult. Conversely, failure to put together parts of any particular stage leads to failure and results in pathology, according to Allen. While motor development and physiological development progress along a seemingly straightforward and sequential path, recent research suggests that the locus of control for psychological development is both internal and external. It suggests that events such as divorce and death trigger entirely different sets of developmental tasks. Recent research is also suggesting that actual events in people's lives are less important than their perception of the events. Culture, gender, race, and the environments which individuals find themselves situated plays out critically in the developmental path. This suggests a very individualistic and unique pattern of development for everyone, indicating multiple pathways. In closing, from personal experience, I can say this. My path has been anything but linear, and I don't feel locked out or cheated of any potential opportunities based on my upbringing. Some of the brightest, most aware, and compassionate people I know have endured terribly challenging childhoods, and it seems that their robust and well-rounded way of being in the world might be because of, and not in spite of, the early suffering. If this is true, further research is needed to determine what hidden skills, talents, and development might be triggered by the experience of a challenging childhood. Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.